And I would guess, based on the way that I experience online interactions, that there's a whole heck of a lot more of this going on than we would like to think.
We've all seen it online, a curious social media profile that seems to troll an account we follow, posting mean comments or just provoking disagreement in a thread. If we're honest, we may have wished we had the chutzpah to do that at some point too, to just show up anonymously online and quote unquote say what we really think, with no blight of conscience. Well, one pastor has done just that. Dr. Josh Buice, president of G3 Ministries, was outed this week for that kind of behavior. And calling in to join Russell, Mike, and me to talk about this topic today is CT's Director of News, Kate Shellnutt. Kate, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Kate, you reported on this story for us here at CT. How did you find out about it, and what exactly happened in the story?
So this was a case where the church and the ministry made an announcement about Josh's firing, or the decision to remove and have him resign. So I found out about it on X, where a lot of this went down in the first place. And I think that's also the place where we've seen the most discussion about it, is people who followed him on X and who maybe followed some of the accounts that that people suspect were his secretly.
Okay. And what was Buice's response to these statements?
So we haven't heard publicly from him. He hasn't made announcements on his social media, which has been taken down, both his X account and his Instagram account. And he also hasn't made any public apology, but there have been apologies made or reported to be made through the ministry, G3, as well as through the church that confronted him about it, where he served as pastor. And it seems like it wasn't the case of him coming forward, but instead suspicions that had mounted up over years that he was behind these accounts. Finally, after a 2-hour-long back and forth with elders, he came clean, they said, about what happened, and ultimately apologized, according to their announcement, and expressed enough remorse that he wants to apologize to each of the people who he has slandered or spoken against. But again, we haven't seen any of that publicly yet. That's just what the church has said so far.
How extensive was his bad behavior online?
So the reports are that he ran at least 4 social media accounts, and there were 2 Substacks and 2 email addresses. We've seen a few folks who, even before this announcement, had some shadowy accounts. You can imagine vague profiles, kind of Guy Fawkes mask, kind of anonymous looking things. So they're kind of deliberately anonymous, where people have suspected, based on the information shared, that this was him. And these were accounts that would talk about G3 and also talk about the speakers, go back at people who criticized G3, as well as people who were involved in it. There were some that talked about Tom Askell. There were some that talked about TGC against G3. And even some that had screenshots of Josh's name, which is one reason people thought of kind of a smoking gun of this being him, as well as stuff personal to his church, where there were people who replied who said, "Hey, Josh, you should just talk about this on an elder board meeting," even to some of these anonymous accounts. So it was enough going back years. They say going back as much as 5 years, and the suspicions go back 2 years. So it was extensive enough for them to remove him as who had been the pastor of this church for 15 years over this behavior.
Russell and Mike, what did you think when you read these statements?
One of the things is I think we have to reckon with the severe mental and emotional health crisis that we have in this country. That you're at a point where the issue is not that you're dealing with people who are quarrelsome, which is a biblical qualification for those who are quarrelsome cannot be in leadership within the church. That's repeated throughout the pastoral epistles. It's not that you have people who are being quarrelsome, it's that you have people who want to take it to an even higher level of quarrelsomeness anonymously. And the real issue, take aside what is happening within the church. Well, seems to me that their process here, at least from everything we can see, is above board. But the sort of online world, the problem is not that this person was being quarrelsome and belligerent and unchristlike. It's that he was doing that to the wrong people, people who are within his own tribe. That itself is, I think, a crisis that's going on. I mean, it's something. When I said to a pastor friend of mine yesterday, I can understand people who blow up their ministries and their consciences for money or sex or all of these age-old temptations, not to prove it, but you can see how that's happening. It takes a specific kind of cultural moment for someone to do that for the sake of being even meaner. That's something we really haven't seen before, and is kind of unique to, not unique in terms of the fallenness of human nature, but unique to the social media moment that can be happening.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, I think what I immediately thought of two other recent situations, fairly recent situations that I think were similar. One was the Thomas Acord controversy from a few years back. Folks who may not be familiar with this, Acord was I believe he was a headmaster at a Latin school, very involved in kind of a reformed, sort of the online reformed world, Christian education. And he was outed as being the owner behind a social media account that was just a blatantly white supremacist, pro-segregation account, and his career was also ruined by that revelation, and I thought of that because I think it does speak to this phenomenon that there's something addictive about cruelty. I mean, it's like any sin, right? There's something addictive about cruelty, and the more you indulge it, the more it demands of you, and you will look for more ways to indulge it, more ways to express it. So multiple accounts, hiding behind anonymous names or fake identities and that sort of thing. I think that's, and I would guess, based on the way that I experience online interactions, that there's a whole heck of a lot more of this going on than we would like to think. The other thing that I thought about, though, was actually an incident that took place with Tom Askell. It involved me. I made a criticism of Ron DeSantis a while back when DeSantis endorsed a Trump policy that I thought was quite cowardly. And Askell's response to me was to call me a homosexual in Greek, and then following on that, he created a public list of names of the Greek term. I think it's I don't speak Greek. I don't know what the pronunciation is, but it's Malakoi. He created this list called Malakoi Boys, and it was a bunch of people that he was critical of, the people who had been publicly critical of him or publicly critical of Trump or critical of DeSantis, and just adds a bunch of his enemies to this thing in a very, very public way. What's remarkable is that Tom Askell paid no price for that, publicly or otherwise, for slandering a bunch of people who differ with him over political issues. That's the world we live in, and it does make you wonder, if Buice had done all of this in a more public way, would it have been treated differently? Would it have worked out differently? Is it the hiding? Is it as Russell said, is it the specific targets that were unacceptable? The cruelty can't be the problem here, though.
I think that's one of the things that makes this case really interesting and kind of confusing to people who have read it, who have talked with me, is that there's a narrative of this that we've seen or kind of expect, which is pastors being mean on the internet, ministry leaders being mean on the internet. And I'll be honest, there's a perception that the corner of the internet where his circles where he publicly was involved, these reformed, you want to say conservative Baptist, but it's kind of like more conservative Baptist, hyper-conservative Baptist, Calvinist circles, that it's not the nicest place there are on the internet. The people who are in his circles, Tom Buck and Tom Askell, are folks that don't pull punches online, that make it really clear who their enemies are and are unafraid to go after them in a way that other people would say, that's way too far, that's way too much, that's not what social media is for. And they've done that freely for a while. And, this is where you think of the kind of worst stereotype of the Theo Bros, which was a term I debated whether or not to use in the article. That's where he existed anyway to a lot of people in their minds. So that wasn't a disqualifying behavior yet. And then to see him take it further, but then take it in a weirdly different direction, which is kind of to turn to his neighbor to the right rather than like the ideological enemy, is kind of strange. And I wonder about there's a lot of calls kind of to pray for his church, pray for the people following him. But there is like an integrity crisis of like, who is this person? Like, what do they actually believe? Do the people that they were literally platforming at a very big growing conference that he seemed to care a lot about, that was a lot of his messaging online was about G3, inviting people to G3, promoting it. The people that you put on stage are now people who you secretly want to take down either for fun or for the cruelty of it, or that you actually have beef with, that you disagree with. It makes it really confusing to follow someone who's leading that way if you don't know the core of their convictions and like what actually matters. I think it would be a really hard path to restoration for someone who set such a confusing path with these secret accounts.
Well, and if you think about Mike mentioned a couple of these other sort of analogous kinds of situations. There's another one. Remember Patriarchy Hannah, where you had someone talking about her life as this trad wife that turned out to be made up, I suppose. You really have these, it's a look into human nature that you have in some of these circumstances, people who are using these anonymous accounts in order to pretend to be somebody they're not. And in other cases, to use these anonymous accounts to hide and conceal who they actually are. You just take this out of this whole controversy and take it out of even the whole social media ecosystem. It really is a reminder of the temptation and pull that we have to do either of those two things, to have the mask and the illusion of something we believe to be good, or to think somehow if I just hide and conceal, nobody will see what's really under there. I mean, that's just addressed throughout the scripture.
Well, Kate, you bring up something really interesting, Kate mentions the path back. And Mike, this was something that really stood out to me because the elders' response to Josh Buice was that he was presently disqualified from serving as an elder, but the elders said, we do not believe at this time that his sin is necessarily permanently disqualifying. And I wonder if we could talk about that. Take me through the reasoning there of this sort of indefinite leave until the church was able to figure out what they were going to do next. Is this just a symptom of that very short memory that we know exists online, that there can be a big flash in the pan and then it's all quiet and we've all moved on?
I think this is a very difficult question, and it gets at it gets at a much larger issue, which is when a pastor publicly sins, when is restoration possible, and what are the steps necessary to get there? The sins that are often seen as sort of permanently disqualifying are, and look, and this varies from tradition to tradition, denomination to denomination, but the sins that are usually seen as permanently disqualifying involve the direct abuse of power. Spiritual abuse of congregation members, sexual abuse of congregation members, infidelity, which often involves a power dynamic, or just infidelity in general. Sexual sin in general can be seen as permanently disqualifying. And so, I mean, I think I think there is room inside the church to have. You will find differences of opinion of people of good conscience about when can a pastor be restored and when can't they. The key ingredient, whether the sin is, telling a white lie or gluttony or cruelty online or anything else, is real and authentic repentance. And I think the problem that if I were connected to this pastor's church, the problem that I would be reckoning with is, what does repentance look like for this kind of cruelty, anonymity, slander, and whatnot, when there's a public record of cruelty, slander, and personal attacks that we looked away from? Again, it comes back to this same central issue. Does restoration require repenting from doing those things to the people we liked? But, the fact that he had a contentious spirit online and did that to people we didn't like, that's fine. In fact, we want to get you back to that as quickly as possible because we still really don't like those people. Or are we actually going to look at the fundamental issue of the heart that is addicted to the personal attacks and the slander? Look, I think pastors are human. Pastors sin. They all do. Every single one of them does. And I know pastors who've gone through extensive restoration processes that were deeply painful and difficult, and took a very long time before they were restored to any kind of ministry. And I think that can be a good thing. That can make you a wiser person, a better shepherd of souls, to have gone through something difficult, and have reckoned with personal sin in that kind of a way. But I think the background of this story doesn't fill me with hope for a glorious restoration and wisdom. God can do that, but I think the church needs to ask itself serious questions about what it was overlooking before all this took place.
And it's really difficult if you are a church and you're trying to figure out how much to talk about in these kinds of situations. So if I read with Charity, their statement, "This is not permanently disqualifying," I imagine what they're trying to do is to say to their own members, look, we're not hiding anything from you. There's not like there's more here that we don't want you to see. And you do have to communicate that to keep people from having a lack of confidence in their leadership. On the other hand, when you've got all kinds of ministries that have used that kind of language as minimizers, it becomes really difficult to know exactly how to publicly communicate what you're having to work through. That's difficult in every situation.
And the church came out with a statement the day after its Monday statement, or the G3 came out with a follow-up statement saying, hey, at first we were going to leave his content up because we believe it's not permanently disqualifying. Then on Tuesday, they came out and said, okay, we've actually, upon further investigation, which leads me to believe they were able to look through some of the actual materials from these anonymous accounts, which they haven't named publicly. They said, we are actually going to remove all of his content from our website. So I think there was some pushback to that, and that notion of how disqualifying is this sin is one that's gotten some chatter online too.
Kate, why did they cancel the entire conference on the basis of one guy?
They also explained that in their follow-up statement because they had gotten a lot of questions, and they said, obviously we think our ministry, G3, can continue without a founder or without our founder and president, not built on a single person. However, since the nature of his attacks were towards our speaker lineup, we felt like it would put them in an uncomfortable position to invite them to continue to speak, given the kind of bad blood that had happened. And they kind of wanted to relieve them of having to be in that uncomfortable position this year, given that the reason that Josh was forced to resign was because he was mean to these specific folks online.
And it was their second controversy this year as well. They had an earlier controversy around, I think it was called the Legacy Pass, where you paid $1,000 and you got exclusive access to.
And that was just like 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And I remember him going back and forth with folks online, explaining or defending. They had kind of he says mismarketed, but there's also that kind of celebrity Christianity air to it that people are suspicious of, where they had a like $1,000 option where you could sit down with the plenary speakers, and they ended up pulling that based on Twitter pushback, essentially. There have been some applause or like praise for the church for transparency in doing this. And the more that I look at ministries where presidents are really buffered, are really given a place where they're not questioned, or if they're questioned and say, hey, no, that's not me, the board accepts that answer. And I do wonder if there wasn't a church involved and it was just the board, even with him as the pastor of this church, would this have ever come to light? It seemed like it took a lot of effort, right? A 2-hour debate for him to come clean based on what the elders of his church were able to do. And again, these elders were also people who were targeted by his anonymous attacks. And so it does make me think so much about the importance of a really diligent board, and how many organizations have a board that would be willing to challenge and oust a president who was denying activity that he was accused of or had evidence against, versus a church that was put in position. Probably hard either way, but you do wonder if it weren't for the church, would these suspicions continue to boil under the surface without real accountability coming?
If you could look forward, what kind of resolution would you hope to see in a situation like this?
There have been a lot of pastors who have said, like, it's a reminder to me of how close I am, or any of us are, to slipping up or having the worst of us come through, that we have these bad impulses within us. I would like to see a real reckoning with how people talk and behave online. I think we talk about that a lot, of like, oh, like, it's toxic, Twitter's a mess, no one wants to be involved in these dialogues. But I haven't seen a great change in what that looks like, to be more charitable, to see people apologize more quickly for speaking too soon, for people asking clarifying questions rather than assuming the worst of people who are their ideological opponents, for people owning past behavior of theirs as being sinful. I think the best case scenario would be a greater sense of scrutiny, self-scrutiny, from Christians who see their platform online or have an online presence.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.